Hi, beautiful community. Let's gossip and learn a tiny bit together by reviewing a minor skirmish I had on Twitter X with Curtis Yarvin. Now, Curtis Yarvin is a kind of neo-reactionary who has currency in a global ideological wave that you could label kind of techno monarchism. And he also has very significant currency among the techno-libertarians who are some of the supporters of the Trump movement. So the way this came up was that I made a comment about the ex-UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak being English. I think I originally commented on it because Konstantin Kissin on YouTube said that Sunak wasn't English, and it's quite clear to me that Sunak is English, and so we needed to talk about this. So let's have a look at my original tweet. And I say, in response to Rishi Sunak posting a photo of himself in Yorkshire, which led to thousands of bot troll, but also angry citizen replies saying, "Hey mate, you're not English." In response to the responses to Sunak's tweet, and I'm not a fan of Sunak's politics, I didn't vote for Sunak. He is certainly not a post-truth populist, but he is somewhat politically entrepreneurial. That's to say, that's the politician who rides the waves of public opinion. However, for self-advancement. However, some of Sunak's statements post-power, post-premiership, especially acknowledging the legitimacy of the Labour government, have been constructive. There's a current of white identity politics brewing under this post by Rishi Sunak. Sunak, who I didn't vote for, is English, very English. Let's be clear on the political order of things. First, we reject white identity politics, and only second, we explore what's fueling it. Now, getting this order right is very, very important because you are endlessly bombarded by me with the idea that somehow what we did in the periods of Clinton and Obama has contributed to Trumpism, fueled Trumpism. That's very, very important. It's very, very important to understand what is it that we have done, or what is it that has happened that we couldn't control that has brought this about. That's very important. But it's secondary when it comes to political action. You need both, but it's secondary because the first thing you do politically is you say no. You say no. And some of the stuff we're going to look at today is stuff that we say no to. So I tweeted that out, and then Curtis Yarvin, who has a small account on Twitter X, I have a very small one. He's probably only about 50K. I'm about 20K. So these are not tweets that are going sort of exponentially around the internet and getting millions of views. He just replies, "You can tell he's not English by the teeth." That's to say that Sunak's teeth are pretty good, and so he can't possibly be English. Well, that's not entirely untrue, especially if you compare Brits to Americans. But a lot of Americans have scarily good teeth, suspiciously good. I mean, if you have a teeth beyond a certain level of quality, you actually make yourself epistemically suspicious. Now, I reply to that by saying, I said that Sunak is English. And then Curtis Yarvin chips in and says that Sunak's teeth are too good for that. It's a reply that looks for its own round of applause. Demure, but edgy. Think post-truth politics here. Saying and not saying something. Irony as itself, not a break from seriousness, but a substitution for seriousness. It's a reply that looks for its own round of applause, demure but edgy, with a dollop of soft fascism, the instinct to exclude people from categories they rightfully belong to. That's my definition of soft fascism if you want one. it's a psychological definition. I sit around and I say, ooh, Chinese are that, or Russians are this, when in fact, there are certain categories from which no human should be excluded. Now, I am temperamental when it comes to whether you want a concept like soft fascism. There is a good reason not to have it, because you want fascism to be something fairly clear and fairly bad in politics. But at the same time, it does capture something psychologically. So it's a matter of sensibility whether you use that term or not. And I would say that I sometimes use it and often I go without it. I try to not use it too much. But the psychology there is that I go about the world excluding people from categories to which they rightfully belong. And here I'm implying that Rishi Sunak is English, and that therefore excluding him from that category is psychologically an expression of perhaps the mildest of soft fascisms. Now here, Curtis Yarvin comes back and he says, you can't deny that Rishi speaks perfect English. Pictured a Japanese man as Jared Taylor, a white nationalist who was born in Japan to missionary parents. And then I reply, and I'm not replying to Curtis Yarvin, I'm replying for your benefit, really, with quite an absurd sketch, but it's an absurd sketch in the right direction. I say there is an ethnic concept of Englishness, and there is a national identity concept of Englishness. And I say we need both in politics. Now, how do the two relate? National identity is not reducible to ethnicity. Ethnicity is an important but not essential component of national identity. So what about the Japanese man line? Now, how national identity and ethnic identity relate is not fixed. That relation needs to be constructed. And it's entirely reasonable that in some cultures, the ethnic component will play a bigger part. Moments of cultural moment will weigh this differently. In the case of Englishness, although this applies more widely to, I don't want to say how widely, because then we're going to have to say quite a lot about what it means to construct the concept of a national identity under different cultural circumstances. That'll require too much time. But in the case of Englishness, I recommend 4 sort of loose but constitutively weighty components. One is affirmation. So it matters to me whether Rishi Sunak actually says, oh yeah, I'm English, I feel English. Rishi Sunak does indeed say that, and that actually matters to me. If he never said that, then the question would be, is that something that he would say, right? If you asked him, would he say yes? The second component is indeed ethnic identity. That's quite simply what happens to you when you go on 23andMe. The third element is psychology. How much Englishness conditions one's thoughts and sentiments. And the fourth category is civic identification, how much Englishness structures one's civic and political character. So 3 here is, if you like, more about private sentiment. 4 is more about civic and political belonging, civic and political identification. And I conclude, even though Sunak is not ethnically English, he is too high on 1, 3, and 4 for us not to say that he is both English by national identity and English, period. So what I'm essentially saying is that first, we've got 2 ideas that we need: ethnic Englishness and Englishness as national belonging. We need both of these concepts. And then what I'm also saying, secondly, is that we need a general concept of Englishness that will include both of these. I don't think you can do without a concept of Englishness that includes both. That's to say, it's both something that's constructive for us to do, but it is also, to a very large extent, something that we already do. We would have to change quite a lot for as to not need these two things. The first thing is a distinction between ethnic Englishness and Englishness as national identity. And the second thing is a concept that actually incorporates both. A concept where you can say that parts 1, 3, and 4 are very, very important, but that part 2 also plays some kind of a role. Now, of course, there was an outbreak of excretion from bots and trolls and then genuinely angry citizens. So let's take a brief peek at this. Some of it took the form of ethical nostalgia, like this remark. Vlad, your elitist luxury ideas have real-life costs for normal human beings who have blood and soil feelings. Right? Alarming language. It's only bad when it's white people. There's a picture of Nietzsche there. Now notice that the appropriation of Nietzsche by the post-democratic ex-right is kind of pop-derived rather than seriously derived. Roughly with Nietzsche, the more fascist he seems and the more postmodernist he seems, and I don't pull these things apart entirely, because a postmodern conception of politics does rather lead to what we got in the middle of the 20th century, funnily enough. And note how alarming that is for certain progressive conceptions of social justice that rely on postmodernism. There ain't no way to get to serious politics from postmodernism that is not something like what we saw in the 20th century, middle of the 20th century. That's because you give up on truth as a social value. But with Nietzsche, roughly speaking, the more fascist he is, the more postmodernist he is, the more it's stuff you find either in what got published when he was dead or incapacitated by his malign sister, or works by Nietzsche which he himself chose not to publish. So, for instance, the centerpiece of postmodernist discourse on Nietzsche in literature departments, putting fascism aside for a moment, is largely based on a piece called On Truth and Lies in an Extramoral Sense, which Nietzsche chose not to publish. Right? So there's a lot of unbalanced appropriation going on there. I suppose the second category of comments was logical indignation. Sunak is not English because he's a UK citizen, but he can never be English any more than a white person moving to India could become Indian no matter how long he was there for. And I think what this forgets is the constructedness of civic and cultural belonging, therefore its contestability, and therefore that its constructedness is a matter of cultural difference. How our concepts of national belonging are elaborated is both something that changes as we debate it, and is also something that expresses itself very differently in different cultural circumstances. Think the most extreme multicultural societies and the least multicultural societies. Then there was obviously a dollop of punitive fantasy. I omit the more unlovely threats. You're wrong, and in a just society you would be whipped. Now, while that, of course, is something we really don't approve of at all, there is, in principle, some normative space for saying that certain things that aren't punished and shouldn't be punished by law in our society should be punishable in some kind of ideal social order we could never attain. So, for instance, it's a sensibility that I actually encourage, that while you'd never want to translate this into practice, and it's entirely self-defeating in practice, at a hypothetical level of idealization, it is worth contemplating what kind of very severe punishments might be appropriate to public figures who don't do bad things, but who do bad things that break the democratic game. There is an idealized society out there only in our imagination in which systematic deception in public, in which the most gross forms of political irresponsibility would actually be criminalized, heavily criminalized, right? That's a social order in which Boris Johnson would be in trouble. I don't recommend that remotely in practice. In practice, we can just say things like this person shouldn't be anywhere near public life. But that kind of thought experiment is not entirely unreasonable. You can travel in that direction. It's just you're not going to be able to travel in that direction in practice. There's a lot of obviation. He's obviously not English. And there's a lot of positive vibes. Aren't you dying? So let's assess this a little bit. Reading and hearing a little bit Curtis Yarvin, immediately a question about neurodiversity arises. You might have, well, Vlad, can't you just shut up about it? You can't stop going on about either autism or ADHD. Well, sometimes if you want to understand how somebody's brain works, you've got to raise that question. But to spare you now, what I'll do is just raise the question and make a generic remark. And the generic remark is that people who have just autism, because of course there's lots of people who have autism and ADHD, and just ADHD without autism, but people who have just autism, if they are in public life, if they're commentators, you might ask, well, what are the structured risks or the structured benefits that their work might typically generate? What could they do that neurotypical people are going to be less good at, and what could be pitfalls for them that neurotypical people would be better at? And I think one thing you can clearly say is that for some autistic people in our public life, it's easier to get a clarity about something which is too fuzzy for the rest of us. Often the neurotypical commentator will go a 3.8 on something that's actually a 4 because it just doesn't quite feel An autistic person will say, it's 4. There is no need to say 3.8, it's 4. Because it's 4. If it weren't 4, it wouldn't be 4, but it is 4, and so we say 4. We don't need to say 3.8 because we're always like... So there's one generic path of sort of, autistic superiority. A generic path of autistic risk is to prematurely arrive, it's virtually the reverse of what I've just said, to prematurely arrive at a kind of excessive generalization or excessive clarity, right? So I have parquet floors, I have autism, I'm a public commentator, I have a leak from above, my parquet floor is somewhat ruined, and it generates lots of splinters. And instead of thinking about it as an accident that just happened above me, I go on to just widely recommend that parquet floors are not advisable. Enough on this. Let's analyze politically what's going on here. Now, the first thing to say is this is not trivial stuff. This is not trivial stuff. Curtis Yarvin type ideas are not just prominent, they're becoming more prominent. The second thing to say is that there is an element of constitutive unseriousness to a lot of post-democratic authoritarian thought. Look at Dugin too. A lot of these people are not trying to beat you by being better public intellectuals. They're trying to beat you by being better intellectual entertainers. So funnily enough, it is a very, very consumerist product. It's about entertainment more than substance, but that makes it all the more alluring in a world where there is both a crisis of trust and the proliferation of social media in its current shape. Now, I think another thing worth saying, it's really important, we often emphasize, is that these people are not conservatives. Curtis Yarvin is not a conservative. He is a reactionary of a revolutionary type. And note when we talk about, in ideological terms, the beginnings of fascization, we always think about two elements coming together: a radical transformation of society via a return to a golden past that typically never was. So there's something fascism draws from conservatism and from radical traditions, socialist traditions, which often leads people to sort of, wonder whether fascism is a species of conservatism or a species of socialism. Of course, it isn't. It's its own ideology, but that's just an expression of the inheritances and fluidity of ideology. Ideology is not a set of propositional claims. It's a way humans carry images as they negotiate the political world. And so I suppose the last thing I want to put on the table is that when we encounter these ideas, it's very important not to just mock them as wrong, because you're not going to defeat them like that. It's wrong to treat these ideas as kind of intellectual mistake. Well, yes, Curtis Yarvin says that, but his position is imbecilic, and so therefore I don't care. You should care, because you're losing to him. You're not specifically losing to Curtis Yarvin, but insofar as Curtis Yarvin sort of sellotapes himself onto, or is just organically immersed in, a kind of global wash of hyper-neoliberal monarchist ideology, he is on the winning side. He's not winning in the sense that currently Western democracies don't look like a society he'd like to see. But he is winning in the sense that the trend is in his favor rather than in our favor. In other words, 10 years from now, things will look more Yarvin-like than Vlad-like. And that's why we're going to have to keep engaging in a hopeful and truthful and constructive way. Lots of love.